Hello, and greetings from New York City. My name is Lance Strate. I'm professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. I'm also the president of the Institute of General Semantics. And most significantly for this talk, I am the chair of the academic division of the Global Listening Center and chair of the Global Listening Festival of 2022. And it's great to be a part of this fantastic event that we've organized for you. The title of my talk is Sounding Off About Listening. And I want to start by pointing to a song that you ought to be familiar with. I hope you're familiar with, but it depends, I guess, on your age as well. But it's a song by Simon and Garfunkel called The Sound of Silence. And in that song, there's the line, people hearing without listening. And that represents a restatement of the old saying, in one ear and out the other. The contrast between hearing and listening is quite a cliche, a very big cliche, really. And with the term hearing in that cliche representing a less desirable form of listening, one that might be characterized as poor, weak, half-hearted, inattentive, careless, and the like. And this hearing versus listening dichotomy really just substitutes for the more complicated notion that there are not just two, but there are many different types of listening, and some better or more effective than others. So consequently, the binary opposition between hearing and listening stands as a vast oversimplification regarding the relationship between hearing and listening. And I would add one that is ultimately misleading. I don't mean to deny that the contrast that's drawn between hearing and listening can be used as a heuristic device to introduce the idea that listening is a more complex phenomenon than it might have first appear to be, but we need to be wary of reifying the hearing versus listening formula. So to that end, I would invoke the discipline of general semantics, and in particular, the extensional device introduced by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist, where he recommended turning singular terms into plural terms to avoid this idea that everything is all alike. And so we could exchange the singular term listening for the plural form listenings to make us mindful that there are a number of different varieties of this activity. Not only are there different ways of listening, but there are differences in who or what we listen to, and each one is different. To one, listening to one other person as opposed to several people in a group setting, as opposed to listening to a speaker giving a public address or a lecture, as opposed to listening to a poet performing or an actor in a play or a singer singing a song, etc. There are differences between listening to other people speaking in our own language and listening to foreign languages being spoken that we don't understand, or listening to the nonverbal paralanguage of infants and adults, or listening to animal vocalizations, or listening again to song and music, or listening to the sounds of nature, listening to machines, listening to the sounds of the body, as physicians are wont to do, listening to ourselves speak, listening to our inner voice, that sense of thought that we hear, the inner dialogue or inner monologue, or listening to imaginary voices, listening to some form of the divine or supernatural. And there are differences between listening in a home, listening in an office, listening in a classroom, a courtroom, a bar, a church, and so on. There are differences between listening in an informal setting, listening to a formal presentation or performance, and listening, as you are now, to recordings, transmissions, broadcasts, not to mention listening to computer synthesized speech and sounds and so on. All of these are all differences that make a difference, to use Gregory Bateson's happy phrase. And they're differences that can be studied via the media ecology approach. Now, in the field of media ecology, the question of how we do things is paramount. And the fact that different sensory organs function in entirely different ways becomes quite significant, especially in the work of scholars such as Marshall McLuhan, Edmund Carpenter, and Walter Ong. And an emphasis on the significance of sense perception and sensory organs opens up a different way of thinking about the relationship between hearing and listening. Rather than considering hearing to be an inferior kind of listening, we can understand that hearing is the basis and foundation of listening, and that all or most of the key characteristics that we associate with listening are made possible by the sense of hearing. Even when listening is used metaphorically, it's essential to understand the basis of that metaphor, which is the sensory organ of the human ear. As linguistics researchers George Lakoff and Mark Johnson explain, metaphors are rooted in the human body and embodied experience. A well-known example of the metaphor at work can be heard in the famous Shakespeare quote from Julius Caesar, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." So the loan requested by Mark Antony is not of the literal sort associated with Vincent van Gogh, rather a contemporary expression that could substitute for "lend me your ears" would be "listen up." Another contemporary utterance, "I hear you," does not simply refer to someone speaking with sufficient volume or clarity, but rather goes beyond the openness typically implied by listening to indicate comprehension and understanding. This may well be related to the secondary meaning of hearing, which refers to the ability or opportunity to be heard, to express your opinion, to tell your story, to state your case. What I mean is, as in the phrase, receiving a fair hearing. In this instance, the sense of hearing again serves as a metaphor for listening, a metaphor that's used for the most part unconsciously. The point is that in order to understand listening, we also need to understand hearing as a form of sense perception. This has long been clear in regard to language, because all languages are oral. That is, all languages are tongues, existing first and foremost as a form of speech. It follows that hearing, and therefore listening, are intimately connected to our capacity for linguistic communication, which is also the basis of our ability to engage in time binding. The process of language acquisition begins in infancy, and vocalization begins with the first breath drawn after birth as the newborn begins to cry. But hearing takes place prenatally, as the fluid medium of the womb is an excellent conveyor of sound, even better than the air that we are normally used to hearing in, and especially transmits the sound of the mother's voice and heartbeat. Hearing comes before speaking, and hearing also comes before seeing, because the womb is an environment without light. The contrast between the eye and the ear has been of particular interest to media ecology scholars. Consider the difference in the structure of the sensory organs. One obvious distinction is that we can close our eyes, but not our ears. Our sense of hearing is always on, a constant monitoring of our environment. Seeing is also directional, as we must choose where to look, where to direct our field of vision, which is always a small subset of what we can potentially shift our gaze towards. The choice of what to look at is also a choice of what not to look at, as we can avert our eyes. True, we can cover our ears, but that typically does not completely block out sound. More importantly, hearing is omnidirectional. No decision is required. Our ears pick up sound from all directions. This helps to explain the evolutionary advantage of speech, and why no human society ever encountered has used sign language instead of speech. A hand signal requires visual contact, while a warning cry can be heard from any position. What this means is that hearing is more of a holistic operation, while seeing is more atomistic, more elementalistic. Put another way, sight is favorable to an analytical frame of mind, breaking things up into pieces, while sound is more conducive to synthesis, putting those pieces back together as a whole. Or as Walter Ong put it, sight isolates, sound incorporates. The anthropologist Edward T. Hall established that there are different senses of space generated by different sensory organs. And Marshall McLuhan, Edmund Carpenter, and others have noted the differences between acoustic and visual space. Acoustic space is the experience of space generated by the sense of hearing. Because hearing is omnidirectional, acoustic space is all around us, surrounding us. In this respect, all sound is surround sound. This sense of space is one that is curved rather than straight, Einsteinian rather than Euclidean. It is circular or oval, spherical or dome-like, just as sound ripples out in all directions, potentially without end. Our position then in acoustic space is at the center of it all, surrounded by what we hear. This centering is not so much egocentric as it is ecological, as it places us inside the world, a part of our environment, integrated into our surroundings, requiring us to live in harmony, harmony being an acoustic metaphor, live in harmony with the world. When we are situated at the center of it all, we are in a subjective position, which is also subjectifying, by which I mean that we treat everything that surrounds us as subjects, alive and conscious. This may be denigrated as anthropomorphism, but it's also consistent with an ecological understanding of the world, not to mention the Gaia hypothesis that the world itself is a living organism. To use Martin Buber's terminology, in acoustic space, we enter into I-you relationships with the world. Now, by way of contrast, the experience of space generated by the sense of vision is unidirectional, dividing the world into bits and pieces, fragmenting the environment. Where acoustic space has no necessary limits, visual space is intrinsically one of boundaries, especially as intensified by the invention of writing. Visual space favors the linear, just as writing is in lines, and the quadrilinear, just as the page is in a quadrangle, square or quadrangle. Denise Schmont-Besserat has shown how the introduction of writing in ancient Mesopotamia and later in Egypt altered pictorial art and decoration as images began to be lined up in rows following the example of written characters. A similar change can be seen in architecture, as the typical structure of oral cultures is rounded or non-linear. For example, the hut, the teepee, the igloo. While following the introduction of writing and the advent of literacy, straight lines and right angles increasingly come to dominate on all levels, from furniture and rooms to buildings and streets. Significantly, in visual space, the portion of the world that we are attending to is laid out in front of us, especially as our gaze employs a fixed point of view based on the habit of reading. So we find ourselves distanced and detached from the world on the outside, looking in, alienated from our environment, in the position of being spectators, voyeurs, peeping toms. In this sense, we are outside of the world, not a part of it. Not really, but that's how it feels. This situates us in an objective position, giving us the illusion of being completely separate from our environment, uninvolved, not participating in it. To be objective is to objectify the world and all that it contains, to treat everything in our environment as objects, things to be owned, controlled, manipulated. In Buber's terms, we enter into an I-it relationship with the world. It follows that the shift from morality to literacy is accompanied by a shift in emphasis from the acoustic space to visual space, and this results in a changing view of the world. In oral cultures, people believe themselves to be part of the world, and they endeavor to live in harmony with it. But in literate cultures, people came to see themselves as separate and apart from nature, which they came to view as an object to try to own, manipulate, dominate, and control. This is particularly characteristic of Western culture, defined as it has been by alphabetic literacy. Visualism especially comes to the fore with the printing revolution in early modern Europe, which was a necessary prerequisite for modern science and modernity in general. In the 20th century, however, according to McLuhan, Carpenter, Ong, and others, the electronic media restored to some extent the experience of acoustic space, accounting for the rise of ecological consciousness and the environmental movement in the mid-20th century. And I'd also suggest that it's no accident that listening emerges as a distinct area of interest and subject of investigation over the past half century. Rather, it is a natural response to our various forms of electronically mediated orality. In an odd way, while opportunities to listen and choices as what to listen to have increased over the past century through radio, sound recording, sound movies, talkies in other words, television, so on. But speech itself has waned in significant ways. The activity of public speaking has come to be feared more than death. Interest in and respect for poetry has gone into steep decline, and the ability to engage in conversation, as Sherry Turkle notes, is the equivalent of an endangered species. Listening has moved from the background to the foreground, and we do need to improve our ability to listen to the mediated voices that clamor for our attention, the journalists, opinionists, and propagandists in particular. But there is also cause for concern when it comes to our ability to listen to others in face-to-face situations, in dialogue, in group settings, and at lectures. While bringing listening to the fore, the electronic media has also created unprecedented challenges to our ability to listen as we grow habituated to the slick, edited, altered, and amplified voices. And that leads us to expect a level of stimulation and amusement that cannot be matched in physical situations. And there is so much noise being generated that as much as we are listening and forced to listen, it becomes increasingly more difficult to pick out what we really need to listen in a deliberate, critical, and conscientious manner. You might say that now people are in fact listening without hearing. Recognizing the auditory nature of listening helps us to understand its significance. Consider what might be the equivalent of listening based on the visual sense. Is watching the same experience as listening? Is observing the same? Is regarding the same? If I say, I see you, is it the same as saying, I hear you? Or consider one of the most pervasive metaphors in the humanities, originating from modern languages and literary studies, that of reading, which carries a connotation of interpretation. So scholars produce readings of film, readings of television programs, readings of songs and musical compositions. In this usage, reading is applied to objects, not subjects. Reading other people's nonverbal communication, their so-called body language, is not listening to what they're saying, but rather trying to detect the unconscious signal they're giving off, signals that they themselves may not be aware of. This is what's meant by reading someone like a book. It is an objectifying act. The sense of sight connects us to the world of objects, and we value it greatly for its utilitarian functions. But the sense of hearing connects us not only to an aspect of our surroundings, but to other people. And while there are ways to compensate, nothing quite substitutes for the intimacy of sound. Hearing is communal, bringing people together as a group. When everyone is hearing the same thing at the same time, there's a sense of unity. Whereas if everyone is asked to read the same exact written work at the same exact time, even then we read as isolated individuals. It's not an accident that audience is a singular noun, readers a plural one. The communal quality of reading also contributes to the association between sound and the sense of the sacred and the spiritual. And I'd add that it's really significant that Helen Keller, who lost her sense of sight and sound as a child, was asked which of the two would she rather have. And she said that she would rather have hearing over seeing, which many people would think it's the opposite. But when asked why, she said that people are kinder to people who are blind than people who are deaf. And the underlying sense of that is that with a sense of hearing, you can still connect to other people. And that is the great challenge when you lose that sense of hearing. So to summarize, the sense of hearing can be characterized as holistic, nonlinear, unbounded, ecological, harmonizing, subjective, relational, communal, and spiritual. Insofar as hearing constitutes the basis of listening, these characteristics also extend to listening and help to clarify the significance of listening as a practice and as an area of study. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing.